A happy Monday to all. This is Rabbi Sachs. Welcome to the Chai Academy. It is good to be back after a weekend break, and what a hot day it is. You feel God's warmth and God's shine. So we last week we discussed Maimonides' concept of Mashiach, of Messiah, and we had two classes on that. And that got me to thinking that there are many people who study a daily chapter of Rambam, of Maimonides. Maimonides wrote a book called Mishneh Torah, and basically Maimonides prides himself that this goes through every aspect of Judaism. So some are fit for classes, some talk about sacrifices. Clearly, we're going to have people nod off, but regardless, he does from soup to nuts, A to Z. Just an incredible book, and it's organized, etc. What's interesting is that there are some that do 3 chapters a day. There's some that do 1 chapter a day. For those that do 3 chapters a day, they're about 30 chapters, because it just started. The cycle just started, and those who do 1 chapter a day finish once every 3 years. Those who do 3 chapters a day finish once a year, and it's a quota thing. So we figured we would, because we're starting the book again. There's some fascinating chapters right in the beginning, and are so fundamental that we will discuss Maimonides' book. Now, he has 14 books that he wrote. The first book is called Sefer HaMada, the book of knowledge, right? The book of knowledge. And he goes through fundamentals. So we'll begin. We won't go through line by line. We'll talk about it, but you'll glean so much information. So the very first words of his book, the very first words are, the foundation of all foundations, and the pillar of wisdom. What is a foundation? If you don't have a foundation, you cannot build a building. If you do not have a foundation, you cannot build a wall. A foundation allows you to build upon. So it's on purpose that he calls it a foundation, because if you do not believe in this thing we're about to share, then you cannot go to B. You cannot believe in B. You cannot be involved in B. And what is it? He says that the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a primary being, God, who brought all existence into being. So that's the foundation. The foundation is, if you don't believe, if you do not believe that there is a primary being who brought all other existence into being, then you're not going to study the Torah properly. You're not going to follow God's will. You're not going to bother studying the book of Maimonides, because it is a fundamental. The fundamental is laid down. He uses the term know, not believe. He uses the term know. Why know? Because he's going to try and lay it out to the best of his ability, knowledge of godliness. Now, obviously, we can't know everything, but that's his goal, and that's why this book is called the Book of Knowledge, because he's going to lay it out in knowledge. So the foundational rule, in order to do anything, to have any morals, any values, etc., is to know that there is a primary being who brought all existence into being. Right? Now, all existence, we're talking about earth. We're talking about heaven, and anything that's found in heaven, anything that's found in earth. In other words, there was no mass prior to God's bringing the world into being. There was nothing for him to work with. There was nothing, right? So that's why he uses the term v'chol hanimtzoim, everything, whether it's on earth, whether it's in heaven, whether it's anything in between. It's only because there is a primary being. Now, he says now, and if you do not believe, and the next thing to believe rather, is that if there is no God, right, nothing could exist. And he doesn't explain it here, but we studied in Tanya in great length that the concept that God created the world from nothing. So Maimonides agrees there was no mass, there was nothing. Because you created it from nothing, there is no way that the world can exist if God doesn't exist. Something can exist if it was created from something. So you take a piece of wood, take a tree, cut it down, take a piece of wood, and then you mold that wood into a barrel. So that's creating something from something. But there was wood, and that's why you could walk away, explains Tanya. But if you created it from nothing, you can't walk away. So there was nothing. There was no mass. There was no quote unquote Big Bang that created the world. It was God that created the Big Bang that created the world. That's the way Maimonides views it. And he says, if there's no God, there's no world. But there can be a God without a world. That is not a contradiction. So, and Maimonides continues. The God controls everything in this world. He controls the world that's revolving on its axis. God controls anything and everything, and there is no beginning, there's no end to God. God is infinite. There is only one thing that is infinite, and that is God. Everything else, it may be high numbers, it may take travel in space. You may have to travel 150 years to reach the end of space, but you will reach the end of space. God is infinite. Right? What's interesting is numbers infinite, right? So you have 30 trillion, and you add one, it's 30 trillion and one. And is that the end? No, there's 30 trillion and two, etc. Now, knowing, not believing. This is where Maimonides is very, very clear. Knowing that there's a God is a biblical command, right? When it says in the Ten Commandments, 10 Principles, I am the Lord your God, right? And so he says it's implied that you have to know it for a fact and not just believe it. And then he says furthermore that if a person presumes that there is a dualism going on, if the person presumes that yes, I believe in God, but there are also other forces not in God's control, because clearly there are other forces, but they're all in God's control. If one believes that these forces are not in God's control, he says that is a denial of God. So it's not. So it's fascinating. Most people think you deny God. No, God doesn't exist. So that's a denial of God, and that would be a biblical infraction also. But Maimonides doesn't say that. Maimonides says, when you can have a biblical infraction of denial of God is if you think there's 2 powers, 3 powers, 4 powers. There's the God of day, God of night. There's the God of Mondays, and there's the God of Tuesdays. Or that God is 90% and there's another power that's 10%. He says that would be a complete negation of God, not just 10%, a complete negation of God, because it is an error in the fundamental. So that's a very clear direction from Maimonides, and he says that if one believes that there is something in addition to God that is autonomous, he says that is a violation of a biblical command. So remember, there's 613 biblical commands. One of them is to know God. One of them is to the not to deny God. And he says this would be considered a denial of God. He goes further and he says God is not a composite. God is not a bunch of things put together to make this God, but rather God is one, and within God has all the attributes, has everything in it, right? And there's no different things, So H2O is a composite, right? So that's why there's the two in that, right? So he says God is not a composite. God is not compounded of different things, but rather God is a simple oneness that in that oneness has the ability to create everything. And he says, and God is one. God is one. So that's what we say in the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord our God, Hashem Echad, Hashem is one. He says one. Once again, no dualism, nothing else not under his control. Everything else is just a part of God. There's no breakaway. There's no Luther. There's no Satan that can distance himself or break away from God. Right? I heard something very funny the other day, and I searched it, and it is funny. So in Dubai, they have a synagogue in Dubai, which is incredible, which is beautiful. And now recently they have a breakaway synagogue in Dubai, and that completely makes no sense to me, right? You got a synagogue in Dubai, and Dubai's not that big, and now you have a breakaway synagogue in Dubai. So this is the synagogue I won't go to in Dubai. So so there's no breakaways. There's no breakaways from God whatsoever. It's everything is under God's control. Now, what do we mean when we say one? So it's not simply just one, because Maimonides says that's elementary, that there's just one God. It's elementary. He says, what does he mean one? That there's nothing but God. There's not that just there's other things that exist in galaxies afar or in some other universe or whatever it may be. No, there is only God. So it's not just one God. God is not battling with Hercules. There's just one God. In addition, God is the only existence, right? So our existence is really godly. The chair that I'm sitting on is because of God's existence. So therefore, it's subjugated and subjected to God's power of creation. And so there's nothing that there's absolutely nothing that exists other than God. Now, he says God is not a physical form at all. God is not form. God is not matter. God is God. And he says that if there were many gods, how would you even? The only way to say that this is this God and this is this God is to say that this is this energy and that energy. God's not an energy, right? So God is not a form, and God, because God is not a form, God has no body, right? God has no end, right? God, the way it's just God. It's just this oneness of God, and this is what Jews have been. This is our creed. This is what we say. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is our fundamental belief. And I'll tell you something interesting and amazing, in fact, is that the Jews who were marched into the showers, who were then taken and put in the ovens after they died, they said Shema. They said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Right? So because it's part of our creed, so they wouldn't give the Nazis satisfaction to say, "Where is God? How did God let the Holocaust happen?" Right? I denounce God. They didn't. They didn't. Right? They were. Doesn't mean they were happy. Doesn't mean they weren't appalled of the Nazis. Doesn't mean God wasn't appalled of the Nazis. But they. This is what they said. The last words emitted from their lips was, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," because that is what we stand for. That is what it's all about. The Jewish faith and other faiths followed is this concept of monotheism. Right? There is just one God, and the father of our religion, the father of a number of religions, was Abraham. Right? And Abraham, that's what he espoused. And that's why he was the father of our religion, because when he was brought up in a very polytheistic society. Right? His own father was made his living by consulting and selling various idols. Oh, you need fertility, I have the god of fertility. Oh, you need money, I have the god of money. Right? Or you need the God of domestic harmony. Let me get you this, that, and the other. His own father, and that's how he was brought up. He was brought up in this like paganism, and they worshipped anything that moved or didn't move, for that matter. And Abraham, as a young man, said, "This doesn't make sense to me. There has to be more than this." Right? And God said, "Wow. You chose me, I chose you. Because you chose me, I choose you." And he became the father of religions. That's Abraham, the father of many nations. So Abraham was the first. I mean, Adam was a monotheist. Noah was a monotheist, but Abraham was the first one where it caught on, and he preached it to the public. Right, so Abraham was the maybe what today we would call him a missionary, but Noah had his connection with God, and Noah lived a happy life until God asked him how long can he tread water, and so he built an ark. Abraham, right away, as soon as it clicked, Abraham said, "You know what? This is what's sorely lacking in the world: the knowledge of monotheistic belief." And he got it. He recognized that God has no form. He recognized that it couldn't be the sun, because the sun sets. It couldn't be the moon, because the moon gets obscured by clouds. It couldn't be clouds, because sometimes the clouds dissipate. Right? So he said, "Oh my goodness, there is something more to this," and he got it. And he preached it. And Maimonides addresses that if God has no body, if God has no form, how could it say God spoke? How can it say God was angry? How can it say, with the finger of God, or he took the Hebrews, the Israelites, out of Egypt with a strong arm? So it's anthropomorphic. He's making God into this human being. So Maimonides, like others, and there's pretty much agreement in this, is that we have to be able to talk about God. And the only way we know to talk about God is by using these anthropomorphic terms. God spoke. Right? What is speech? Speech is a revelation of what's in your thought. Right? So it says God spoke. God revealed when he wanted. Right? God was angry. Does it mean that God actually lost his temper and you could blood pressure? No. God doesn't get affected by these things, but God basically revealed his displeasure. Not that it made an iota of change in God, but you're welcome, Marianne. Not that it made any right, but it's just the way. We have no choice but to talk this way, because otherwise we're not going to be able to understand each other. So, to say, yes, God revealed what he wished, right? Or you can say, and God spoke. God saw. God doesn't have eyes, a cornea. God doesn't need cataract surgery every 70 to 80 years. It's nothing like that. But God saw, God perceived. So it's just we use these terms because it is how it's our language. It's how we communicate with one another, and God spoke, God said, etc. Now, what's good morning? Good morning. Good day to all. So so that's good morning in California, because in New York it's afternoon, but in California it's good morning. So I'll tell you what the benefit why God created California. I'll tell you is that sometimes I get a call at 9 o'clock in the morning. Rabbi, today is my father's anniversary of passing. Could you say Kaddish this morning for my father's soul? And I said, we already had the services. So what do? I call up California. I wait an hour, call up California, and I call a rabbi and say, could you say Kaddish for so-and-so? So thank God California is 3 hours back. I'm sure that's why God did it. So bail me out. Now, Maimonides also addresses that the prophets, throughout the prophets, they wrote different visions they had of God, right? They had one view God as a warrior, W-A-R, not W-O-R. Another one view God with a lightning sword. One saw God dressed in like a white garb. Someone else saw God in a red garb. So, what is this? What is this all about? So it's basically the limitation of the human being having the prophecy. Right? So it's at that moment when the prophet has the prophecy, and every prophet except for Moses was in a trance. Moses was not in a trance. Every prophet at the moment spoke in tongues. Moses was coherent, and he was upright, he was conscious, etc. So the prophets, the way they saw different things was because of their limitation, not necessarily God's limitation. It's the way, it's we all have dreams, right? It's the way we interpret the dream. That's up to us. It's the way we if we remember the dream, that is. So they because of their limitation of and breadth of scope, limitation of breadth and scope and depth of God. That's why they envisioned God the way they did. But and Moses asked in the Torah, God, let me see you. Let me see you. And God said that nobody can see me and live. So God said, I want to see you the way you are, not my understanding, not my limitation. I want to perceive you, whom you are. And God said no. God said, however, I will show you my back, not my front. Which Maimonides doesn't talk about it here, but it's fascinating. What does it mean that God showed his back? Is that many of us, when things happen to us, when they're spaghetti hits the proverbial fan, and we're in the midst of it, and it's difficult, and what does God want from us? What is this lesson? How come I put a bid on the house, and I had it, and last minute someone took it, and what's right? So sometimes we get it. It may take us a few years. It may take us a few months. Take us a few days. That maybe you didn't get the job because this wouldn't have been the best job for you. Consider yourself lucky you didn't get the job, right? But and sometimes you don't. What God told Moses is that I'm going to give you the benefit of always being able to tell hindsight. You'll always be saying, aha, So that's why that happened. So Moses may not have understood everything about God, but to Moses, it became clear to him why this happened, why this negative thing happened to a good person, why this positive thing happened to a bad person. Moses is able to understand it, maybe not at the moment, but the back. He's able to look back and say, I get it. They say hindsight is 20/20. Moses had 20/20 vision, hindsight. So he was able to get it. Maimonides continues that God doesn't stand, God doesn't sit, God doesn't age, right? God, he's like Keith Richards, also doesn't age. There's no death by God. There's no concept, right? Because to be considered, is God alive? You can't even say God is alive. God is alive and well. That's like audacious, right? So there's no death and there's no anger, etc., etc. So and if it does say it, Maimonides says it's all metaphors. It's all metaphors because we are unable to really put it in words. And something happens in the world, something that displeases God, something that angers God, right? It doesn't alter God. In other words, you can't say that with human beings, right? So your spouse said something so hurtful that it altered you, and it takes you 4 months to get over it. Or your business partner did something, and the relationship is never the same. Right? Why? Because you were affected by your partner's deeds and actions. You thought you were affected by your spouse's verbal tirade, and the relationship changed. You became a different person. You all of a sudden never had this feeling, and now you have this feeling. Positive, negative, by the way, it doesn't matter. With God, the relationship, God doesn't change. He's not affected by our shenanigans. He's not affected by our phenomena. He's just not. So that's why when it says Ani Hashem lo shanisi, right? It's in I think it's in Jeremiah. I think that I am God. I don't change. It means literally, God is not affected. There's nothing that we can say or do to really alter God, to make God differ with us, etc. It just not the case. So this is the Maimonides says there's no separation, there's no connection. It's not that you're connected like you're connected to a person. You can't have. It's not that relationship with God. Right? Now this concludes chapter 1 of Maimonides, of his book, of his first chapter 1 of his first book called Sefer Hamada, the book of knowledge. And tomorrow, please God, we're going to go into chapter 2, where we'll discuss different commandments that are obligated upon us in relationship to God, right? And we'll also discuss why God gave us commandments in general. Why did God give us commandments? Why did He? Maimonides is going to discuss. He's going to take 3 or 4, and we also need to flesh it out. Why did God give us commandments? So thank you, Eileen. Thank you. Tune in tomorrow, and tonight, please God, there's a Tanya class. Tanya tonight is going to discuss. If it says in the Torah that if a person violates God's commandment, by eating on Yom Kippur knowingly, willingly, and they weren't sick, they get charis, they get excision, and they'll die before 50 or 60. Why do we see people live beyond 50 or 60? So he says, what is that all about? So we'll discuss that tonight. All right, a lot of classes. You can always go to the Chai Academy. So that's and see previous classes. We're working on an Instagram site. We're working on a YouTube site just to get it out there to the masses. And we ask you, by the way, share. if you share this, people will study. In this era of COVID, it's hard for them to go into a synagogue and study with a class, but this is perfect. So, thechaicenter.com/academy. Be well.